The warm April evening of 1943 found Joseph Stalin in his Kremlin office studying intelligence reports from multiple sources that documented German preparations for a major summer offensive against the Kursk salient. The Supreme Commander, who had spent 2 years witnessing the Wehrmacht's tactical and operational superiority, who had seen Soviet armies destroyed through encirclement and maneuver, who had learned through bitter experience that German offensive capability remained formidable despite Stalingrad's defeat, was confronting evidence that suggested the upcoming battle at Kursk would represent a decisive test of whether the Red Army had evolved into a force capable of defeating German attacks through defensive preparation and counteroffensive rather than through desperate improvisation and acceptance of catastrophic losses. The intelligence indicated that German forces were concentrating armor in unprecedented numbers for attacks on the northern and southern faces of the Kursk Bulge, that Hitler had postponed the offensive multiple times to allow newer tank models to arrive, and that German command was staking everything on achieving a breakthrough that would restore Wehrmacht offensive dominance and would shift strategic initiative back to Germany. Stalin's recognition that this battle would either validate the Red Army's transformation into a modern military force or would demonstrate that Soviet forces still could not withstand determined German assault, marked his understanding that Kursk would decide not just tactical outcomes, but the fundamental question of which side would dictate the war's course through 1943 and beyond. The background to Stalin's assessment traced to the strategic situation that had developed following the Soviet victory at Stalingrad. The Red Army's winter offensive of 1942–43 had driven German forces back hundreds of kilometers, had liberated substantial Soviet territory, and had created the Kursk salient that projected westward into German lines. The salient represented both opportunity and vulnerability. Opportunity because it positioned Soviet forces for potential offensive operations toward Ukraine. Vulnerability because the Bulge could be attacked from north and south simultaneously in a pincer movement that might encircle Soviet forces within it. Stalin understood from briefings by General Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky that German command would recognize the operational opportunity that Kursk presented and would likely attempt to exploit it. The intelligence that reached Stalin through March and April 1943 came from multiple sources whose convergence created high confidence in the assessments. The Lucy spy ring, operating in Switzerland, provided information from sources within the German High Command about operational planning for the summer offensive. Soviet partisan networks reported German troop concentrations and logistics preparations in areas from which attacks against Kursk would be launched. Aerial reconnaissance photographed German assembly areas and detected the arrival of new equipment. Radio intercepts revealed communications patterns consistent with a major operation being prepared. Each source independently pointed to the same conclusion. German forces were preparing a pincer attack against the Kursk salient, designed to encircle and destroy Soviet forces within it. The Lucy Rings reports proved particularly valuable because they provided details about German operational planning that could not be obtained through other means. The intelligence indicated specific German force allocations, identified units being moved to the Kursk area, and revealed timing estimates for when the offensive would begin. The specificity of Lucy Ring reporting gave it credibility that more general intelligence might have lacked. Though Stalin remained cautious about trusting any single source, given Soviet experience with German deception operations, the partisan intelligence that complemented Lucy Ring reporting provided on-the-ground observations that verified what strategic intelligence was suggesting. Partisan observers behind German lines reported seeing concentrations of armor being assembled in forest areas near Orel, north of the Kursk, and near Belgorod, south of the salient. The partisans documented the arrival of Tiger tanks that Soviet forces had encountered only in limited numbers previously, noted construction of supply depots that would support the major offensive, and observed German engineers improving roads and railroads to handle heavy military traffic. The partisan reporting confirmed that German preparations were real rather than deceptive measures designed to distract Soviet attention from an offensive elsewhere. The aerial reconnaissance that Soviet air forces conducted over German rear areas photographed troop concentrations, equipment marshalling areas, and logistics preparations. The photographs were analyzed by intelligence specialists who compared images taken days apart to track the arrival of new units, to identify specific equipment types based on visual signatures, and to assess readiness of German forces for offensive operations. The photo interpretation provided quantitative assessments of German strength that informed Soviet planning about how many reserves would be needed to defend against and to counterattack the German offensive. The signals intelligence that Soviet radio intercept units collected revealed patterns in German communications that suggested the timing and direction of the planned offensive. The intercepts showed increased radio traffic between German headquarters and units in the Kursk area, detected specific call signs associated with panzer divisions, and identified communications patterns typical of forces preparing for a major operation. While German communication security prevented Soviet forces from reading encrypted messages, the patterns and volumes of traffic provided insights into German intentions that informed Soviet planning. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who had been appointed Deputy Supreme Commander and who had directed successful defensive operations at Moscow and Stalingrad, briefed Stalin in mid-April that intelligence indicated a German offensive at Kursk was virtually certain and that the Red Army faced a fundamental strategic choice. Zhukov outlined two options. Soviet forces could launch a preemptive offensive to disrupt German preparations, or Soviet forces could prepare defensive positions to absorb the German attack and then launch a counteroffensive when German forces had exhausted themselves.
Zhukov's recommendation was for a defensive approach, arguing that German forces would commit their armor to attacks against prepared Soviet defenses, that German losses would be unsustainable, and that a Soviet counteroffensive launched from positions of strength would achieve greater results than a preemptive attack launched before defenses were fully prepared. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, Chief of the General Staff, supported Zhukov's recommendation with detailed operational analysis. Vasilevsky briefed Stalin that German armor concentrated for the Kursk offensive represented a substantial portion of the Wehrmacht's remaining offensive capability, that allowing the Germans to attack prepared defenses would enable the Red Army to inflict losses that Germany could not replace, and that the German offensive would create opportunities for Soviet counteroffensives that could liberate substantial territory. Vasilevsky's briefing emphasized that the defensive approach required faith in the Red Army's capability to withstand German attacks, but that evidence from recent operations suggested Soviet forces had achieved the organizational maturity and defensive competence that made the approach viable. The April conference, where Stalin approved the defensive strategy for Kursk, represented a critical decision that demonstrated the Supreme Commander's evolution as a military leader. Stalin's instinct through the early war had been to order immediate counterattacks rather than to accept a defensive posture, to insist that every position be held rather than to trade space for time, and to reject suggestions that the Red Army should allow the enemy to attack first rather than seizing initiative through offensive action. The approval of a defensive strategy at Kursk showed that Stalin had learned to trust professional military judgment, to accept that sometimes allowing the enemy to attack prepared positions was sounder strategy than attempting to preempt through offensive operations, and that the Red Army had evolved to the point where a defensive then offensive approach could succeed. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Central Front that would defend the northern face of the Kursk salient, received orders in late April to prepare defenses in unprecedented depth. Rokossovsky's engineers began constructing defensive positions that extended over 150 kilometers from forward positions to strategic depth, incorporating multiple defensive belts with interlocking fields of fire, and positioning anti-tank weapons and artillery to cover likely German avenues of advance. The defensive preparations represented application of lessons learned from earlier battles about how to organize defenses that could withstand German armor assaults, and reflected Soviet understanding that German tactical superiority required defensive advantages to neutralize. General Nikolai Vatutin, commanding the Voronezh front that would defend the southern face of the salient, implemented similar defensive preparations with emphasis on anti-tank capabilities. Vatutin's forces emplaced thousands of anti-tank guns in defensive positions, laid extensive minefields to channel German armor into killing zones, and positioned tank reserves to counterattack German penetrations. The preparation reflected recognition that the German offensive would be spearheaded by new heavy tanks, Panthers and Tigers, that Soviet forces had not previously encountered in significant numbers, and that would require concentrated firepower to destroy. The April intelligence reports about German delays in launching the Kursk offensive created a strategic advantage for Soviet forces. Each postponement, from May to June, from June to early July, provided additional time for Soviet defensive preparations, allowed more mines to be laid, gave more time for reserves to be positioned, and enabled more thorough reconnaissance of German assembly areas. Stalin understood from Zhukov's briefings that German delays were working to Soviet advantage, that Hitler's insistence on waiting for more Panthers and Tigers was giving the Red Army time to prepare defenses that would negate the advantages those new tanks were supposed to provide. The April intelligence reports about German force concentrations documented the scale of Wehrmacht commitment to the Kursk operation. The reports indicated that German forces assembling for the offensive included over 40 divisions, approximately 3,000 tanks and assault guns, and 10,000 artillery pieces. The force represented an enormous concentration that demonstrated German command's recognition that the Kursk operation was critical to regaining strategic initiative. The intelligence suggested that German forces would attack with overwhelming local superiority in sectors chosen for breakthrough attempts, and that Soviet defenses would face the maximum test of their capability to withstand German concentrated assault. Stalin's June meetings with front commanders at Kursk demonstrated the Supreme Commander's hands-on approach to ensuring that defensive preparations were adequate. Stalin questioned Rokossovsky and Vatutin closely about defensive depth, about anti-tank weapons deployment, about reserves positioning, and about contingency plans if German forces achieved penetrations. The detailed questioning showed Stalin's understanding that the battle's outcome would depend on defensive preparations and on commanders' ability to respond to developing tactical situations, that micromanaging from Moscow would be counterproductive, but that ensuring preparations were thorough was essential. The partisan operations that intensified through June in areas behind German lines supporting the Kursk offensive demonstrated Soviet operational sophistication. Partisan attacks on German rail lines disrupted movement of supplies and reinforcements to assembly areas, forced Germans to divert troops to security duties, and created uncertainty about whether offensive preparations could be completed on schedule. The partisan coordination with regular Soviet forces showed a level of operational integration that the Wehrmacht had not anticipated Soviet command could achieve.
General Pavel Rotmistrov, whose 5th Guards Tank Army represented a strategic reserve that would be committed to counterattack after the German offensive exhausted itself, briefed Stalin in late June about the readiness of his forces and about planned employment. Rotmistrov explained that his armor would not be committed immediately to defensive battle, but would be held in reserve until German attacks had depleted German strength, then would be committed to a counteroffensive designed to exploit German vulnerabilities. The concept required discipline to maintain reserves despite pressures to commit them to defensive fighting, and reflected Soviet confidence that defenses could hold without committing strategic reserves prematurely. The July 5th launch of Operation Citadel, the German offensive against Kursk, brought reports to Stalin that validated the intelligence predictions and the defensive strategy that had been adopted. German forces attacked from north and south exactly as anticipated, encountered defensive positions that Soviet forces had spent months preparing, and faced defensive firepower that exceeded what German planning had accounted for. Stalin received hourly updates through the first days of the offensive, documenting that Soviet defenses were holding, that German penetrations were being contained, and that German losses in armor and personnel were mounting without achieving the breakthrough that German operational planning required. The July 12th commitment of Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army to counterattack at Prokhorovka represented implementation of the strategy that Stalin had approved in April: absorb the German offensive through prepared defenses, then commit fresh reserves to counteroffensive when German forces were exhausted. The massive tank battle at Prokhorovka involved over 800 tanks in a confined area, resulted in heavy losses to both sides, and marked the point where German offensive momentum was broken and Soviet counteroffensive capabilities were demonstrated. Stalin understood from reports about Prokhorovka that the battle validated the defensive then offensive strategy and proved that the Red Army could engage the Wehrmacht in mobile operations and could achieve operational objectives through superior concentration of force. The July 13th decision by Hitler to terminate Operation Citadel and to withdraw forces from Kursk represented German acknowledgement that the offensive had failed to achieve its objectives, that continuing the attack would consume remaining German armor without corresponding gains, and that strategic initiative had shifted irrevocably to Soviet forces. Stalin received intelligence about Hitler's decision with recognition that the moment he had anticipated had arrived. German offensive capability had been tested against prepared Soviet defenses and had been found inadequate. The Soviet counteroffensives launched in mid-July toward Orel in the north and toward Kharkov in the south demonstrated that the Red Army possessed not just defensive capability, but offensive capability that could exploit German vulnerabilities created by the failed Kursk offensive. The counteroffensives achieved rapid gains, liberated substantial territory, and demonstrated operational tempo that the Wehrmacht could not match given its depleted strength. Stalin understood from reports about the counteroffensive successes that Kursk had indeed been decisive. German forces would never again mount a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The Red Army had seized the initiative that it would maintain through the remainder of the war. The August liberation of Kharkov marked a symbolic victory that demonstrated how completely the strategic situation had shifted. Kharkov had changed hands multiple times through the war and had been a symbol of Wehrmacht offensive capability when German forces had recaptured it in early 1943. The Soviet recapture of Kharkov in August represented not just territorial gain, but demonstration that the Red Army could conduct complex offensive operations, could coordinate multiple fronts, and could achieve objectives despite German efforts to prevent them. The strategic assessment that Stalin's military advisors provided in August emphasized that Kursk had represented the last German attempt to regain strategic initiative through offensive operations, that henceforth German forces would be conducting defensive warfare,
and that the Red Army would dictate the operational tempo and would choose when and where to attack. The assessment concluded that while substantial fighting remained and German forces would contest Soviet advances stubbornly, the fundamental question of which side would control the war's direction had been decided in favor of the Soviet Union.
The casualties that both sides suffered at Kursk documented the battle's intensity and its strategic significance. German forces lost hundreds of thousands of troops killed, wounded, or captured, and lost substantial armor that could not be replaced, consuming reserves that would be desperately needed for defensive operations against subsequent Soviet offensives. Soviet casualties were severe, perhaps higher than German losses in absolute numbers, but the Soviet Union possessed the manpower and industrial capacity to replace losses, while Germany did not. The asymmetry in replacement capability meant that attritional battles favored the Soviet Union and that Germany could not sustain losses at Kursk rates for an extended period. The technological lessons from Kursk demonstrated that German advantages in armor quality were being neutralized by Soviet advantages in numbers and in defensive preparation. The Panther and Tiger tanks that Hitler had waited for before authorizing Citadel proved vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank weapons when engaged in prepared defensive positions, effective strength, and did not provide the decisive advantages that German planning had anticipated. The experience validated the Soviet approach of producing large numbers of adequate weapons rather than smaller numbers of superior weapons, and demonstrated that quantity had a quality all its own when properly employed. The operational lessons that Soviet command learned from Kursk included validation of the defensive then offensive strategy, confirmation that prepared defenses could withstand concentrated German armor attacks, and demonstration that Soviet forces could conduct large-scale counteroffensives that achieved strategic objectives. The lessons informed Soviet planning for subsequent operations through 1943 and 1944, established patterns that would characterize Soviet operations through the remainder of the war, and proved that the Red Army had evolved into a force capable of defeating the Wehrmacht through superior operational planning rather than through desperate measures and acceptance of unlimited casualties. The psychological impact of Kursk on both German and Soviet forces was profound and opposite. German troops who had believed that the Wehrmacht remained superior despite Stalingrad learned at Kursk that Soviet forces could defeat German attacks through competent defense and could conduct successful offensives that German forces could not prevent. Soviet troops who had feared German tactical superiority learned that prepared defenses could stop German armor and that the Red Army could win major battles through better preparation and better operational planning. The psychological shift reinforced the material and operational shifts that were changing the strategic balance. The moment when Stalin learned that Kursk would decide the East cannot be identified as a single revelation because recognition developed progressively through April to July 1943. The April intelligence showing German preparations suggested that a major battle was coming. The strategic choice to adopt a defensive approach rather than a preemptive offensive showed Stalin's understanding that the battle would be a critical test. The successful defense in July demonstrated that the Soviet strategy was sound. The counteroffensive successes validated that the Red Army had achieved offensive capability, matching its defensive competence. By August, Stalin understood that Kursk had indeed been decisive. German offensive capability was broken. The Red Army had seized the initiative. The strategic direction of the war had been determined in favor of the Soviet Union.
The final assessment was that Stalin learned through the Kursk battle that the Red Army had evolved into a force capable of defeating the Wehrmacht through a combination of defensive preparation, operational depth, material superiority, and improving tactical competence. The victory validated a strategic approach that emphasized allowing the enemy to attack prepared positions rather than attempting to preempt through offensive operations whose success was uncertain. The victory demonstrated that the Soviet Union's advantages in manpower and industrial production were being translated into military capabilities that Germany could not match. Stalin recognized that while substantial fighting remained before Germany would be defeated, Kursk had decided the fundamental question of which side would dictate the war's course, and had established that the path to Berlin lay through continued Soviet offensives that the Wehrmacht lacked the capability to prevent.